Swinburne University of Technology.
Today I'm talking with Karen Farquharson, who is Associate Professor and is in charge of research in the Faculty of Health, Arts and Design. And we're talking about the contemporary PhD, the PhD models and how they move a little bit across time, and how at this moment in time there have been quite some significant shifts, I think, Karen.
There have been some significant shifts at Swinburne, but also in general across Australia. So way back in the day when I did my PhD, a PhD was basically a long project with a long thesis, approximately the length of a book. In the last 10-15 years, we've moved to two additional models. One is the artifact and exegesis model, and the other one is the PhD with associated papers. So in addition to doing the sort of traditional PhD, you can do a PhD with an artifact, which is some sort of object that you create. It could be a novel, it could be a thing, could be an art exhibition, and an exegesis, which is the academic theorization of that artifact, an explanation of it, a contribution to knowledge. And then the other model, the newest model, is the PhD with associated papers. And the PhD with associated papers is a PhD that includes publications. So in many of our disciplines, students moving forward need a track record of publication to be employable, to get postdoctoral positions or to get academic positions. And the PhD with associated papers is a really good model for those students, because as they're going through their thesis, they publish parts of it as journal articles, essentially. And they, at the end of it, would have 3, 4, 5 journal articles already published, which would be a really good outcome for them.
And this indicates to me that traditionally the PhD was really for academics, wasn't it, to go on in their academic life. But the contemporary PhD is really undertaken by people from outside the academic world much more than it ever was before. So I guess the artifact and exegesis model and the associated papers model is something that enables outside knowledge and industry into the academy too.
It does, particularly the artifact and exegesis model. Some people who are very firmly academics and have come straight through an academic pathway go and do the associated papers model. The associated papers model has been a model in science disciplines for quite some time. It's just now entering into the arts, social sciences and humanities. In our faculty, the group that is most likely to use the PhD with associated papers model at the moment is psychology, where it has a bit of a longer history. But other disciplines are starting to adopt it. And I think it's very important for a student who's considering what model of PhD to do, to talk to their supervisor and think about the norms in their discipline, and make a decision based on what they think they want to do after the PhD and the norms in their discipline. One thing that students do have to be quite careful about is to do the PhD with associated papers, you need to have at least one article actually published, at least another one accepted for publication, and at least a third one under review somewhere. In many disciplines, the time it takes to get an article actually published can be a couple of years, and you don't have that long. So you need to be quite careful where you're sending the articles. You want it to be a reputable journal, but you also need to be realistic about, if for your discipline, how long the turnaround times are for you to get things published.
The group of 8 have published a paper talking about wicked problems and the fact that you no longer can sort of just have a focused research question. Perhaps a group would work on it or an individual would work on it. And certainly when we talk to design people about it, they feel that they've been dealing with this for some time. It's kind of the big data, wicked problems kind of question. Have you any thoughts about that?
Well, a PhD, on the one hand, has to be you contributing something original to the body of knowledge we have. How you do that, though, can be as part of a team. So it's perfectly appropriate for you to work on a team. The PhD with associated papers, those papers can be joint publications. Right. They can be. They don't have to be sole-authored publications. You do have to be the first author, and you do have to identify which bits of the paper were yours. So you have to identify what your contribution to the paper was. And it's very important to be extremely clear about what you did, how you, which bits you conceptualized. For example, if you're doing something that requires a bunch of stuff, but one specific little bit of stats that you didn't have the knowledge for, but one of the co-authors did the statistics, you need to be really clear that you didn't do those statistics, that that person did. But highlight what you did. and then what you did across your body of publications will need to be a substantial contribution to knowledge.
And
the more authors, probably the more publications you should have in your PhD with associated papers.
And these are not papers which have already been done. They're papers that you take on from becoming a PhD candidate.
They're new papers, a new project that's your PhD project. They can't be papers that you had in the train before you enrolled in the PhD. It's new research.
And they're embedded in some way in the final submission?
In the PhD with associated papers, you have an introduction, you have a literature review, you might have a research method section. It really depends on what kinds of papers they are. Then you present your papers, you contextualize the papers for the reader, and at the end you have a conclusion. And the conclusion draws together your contribution through those papers. So the surrounding matter, the introduction, the literature review, method stuff at the beginning, and the conclusion at the end is really highlighting what your individual contribution to knowledge is. The PhD with associated papers at Swinburne has very clear guidelines around the kinds of surrounding matter that you need to have with it, although that can be discipline specific. But we do have good guidelines that help guide students who want to do that sort of model of PhD.
Yes, it's a very interesting new model, and I can see possibilities for people outside the academic stream to bring knowledge into the academy through that model too.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, and I think in our Faculty of Business and Law we do have a practice-focused PhD. I'm not sure if they're using the PhD with associated papers, but I think that would definitely be a good possibility for them. And we do have increasing numbers of students in our faculty who are coming in sort of mid-career in another career who want to participate in a PhD, become an expert in a new area, gain some project conceptualization and management skills, and do that through the PhD.
So it's really a twist on the traditional model, isn't it? Where in the traditional model you publish afterwards the new knowledge that you've embedded in your traditional PhD, but this way you're publishing before. With the traditional model, of course, you may go on to publish a book later, but I don't see that you would not go on to publish a book in this way. You just wouldn't be able to use those papers in full. That's
right. You could turn, I mean, it's a new project, and the project has its findings, and you could turn those into a book. I think if the papers are co-authored, then you'd have to negotiate the book with your co-authors and potentially co-author a book. I think what you've just raised there is a really interesting disciplinary issue as well, Josie, because some disciplines are book disciplines, in that for you to be a serious scholar in them, you need to have a sole authored book still today. And so there's a tension between publishing everything as articles, in which case they're not as attractive to book publishers, and or doing the whole thing, publishing it as a book and going on from there. And again, it's a very discipline-specific thing. I'm a sociologist. In my field, in some parts of the world, sociology is a book discipline. So in North America, it's a book discipline for sure. In Europe, for parts of Europe, it's a book discipline. In Australia, it's more of a journal article discipline.
Right.
So you really do have to take into account your local context and think about what it is you want to do with the PhD at the end. If it's going to be important for you to have a book, probably it's best for you to do the traditional model. That said, even students who do a traditional PhD are helped if they get a couple of publications while they are PhD students out of the PhD. So it might be that one of your chapters of your PhD you adapt into a journal article, or two of the chapters of your PhD you adapt into journal articles. They wouldn't look the same as the chapters in the actual PhD, and they'd probably look quite different if you put it into a book at the end. But that's a way around of doing both, sort of.
In many ways, then, the PhD is evolving in different directions, isn't it? For example, the Artefact and Exegesis PhD draws in people from the writing community very strongly, or from the artistic community very strongly. So they may not be looking for traditional scholarship as the outcome.
Yes.
Is that a bit of a challenge for you as a research leader?
The exegesis is a scholarly piece of work. So, I mean, I guess it depends on what we think about as being a scholarly outcome. There have always been people who have artistic pursuits within universities. Universities have always had literature departments, for example, where people do creative writing. Creative writing is something that's been a traditional pursuit within academia. So is a novel a research outcome?
Well, I would think so.
It depends. Depends. You know,
Yeah.
it depends. Many novels are incredibly well researched,
Yes.
especially if they're historical novels. You know, but even if they're not, it's very difficult for someone to make something up, the whole thing right out of their head. So, I would say that it depends on how you're counting things, and I think it's a very worthwhile model for a PhD, and I think it's really important that we have that model for a PhD.
How do you see the relationship of the PhD to industry and commerce as knowledge? To people from outside the university who say, yes, I'd like to learn a different way of thinking about what I'm doing or embed my work in a different way. Do you see that we're moving in that direction?
In our faculty, not so much. In the business faculty, very much. There are some people in our faculty who come back and do PhDs, especially in our School of Design.
Yes.
People who are designers who want to come back and look at something in great detail and expand their skills in a particular direction. In the other areas, it tends to be people who are interested in a more academic career pathway. But we do have people who do things like policy work, policy research, and market research. So it's not as though people who are coming to do PhDs are always keen on doing academic research. They know they want to do research, but it's often quite applied kinds of research. Quite often people want to work for non-government organizations or for government. So it's not just a one-size-fits-all. And in the more sciencey areas, people do go and work in businesses.
Yes.
And sometimes start their own businesses as a result of doing their PhD.
And of course we have the health sciences in our group
We do.
now, and they are very keen on people having practical application of their work or bringing practical application to the academy, aren't they?
They are, very much so. Very much so.
Well, Karen, thank you very much for this about the contemporary PhD, the movements in the PhD, the ideas behind the PhD, and what you, as the research leader for the Faculty of Health Arts and Design, brings to this understanding of the PhD. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been a Swinburne production.